Hello everyone, tonight our story is about a place where time moves differently, where the rhythm of waves becomes your heartbeat, and where weary souls find the rest they've been searching for without even knowing it. This is the story of the coastal haven, a sanctuary that appears only to those who need it most. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Margaret first saw the sign. She'd been driving for hours along the winding coastal highway, her windshield wipers struggling against the relentless downpour. The stress of the past month weighed heavy on her shoulders. The job she'd lost, the relationship that had ended, the constant worry about her future that kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling until dawn. She hadn't planned to take this route. In fact, she couldn't quite remember deciding to turn off the main highway at all. But here she was, following a narrow road that seemed to curve endlessly along the cliff tops with glimpses of a turbulent ocean far below whenever the rain eased enough to see through the mist. The wooden sign appeared through the gloom like something from a dream, the coastal haven, rest for the weary traveler. The letters were weathered but still legible, carved deep into driftwood that had been polished smooth by years of salt. Below it, an arrow pointed down a gravel path that disappeared into a grove of wind-bent pines. Margaret slowed her car, considering. She hadn't seen another vehicle for miles, and her phone had lost signal somewhere back near the lighthouse she'd passed an hour ago. The smart thing would be to keep driving, to find the main road again, and continue toward the city where she planned to start fresh. But something about the sign called to her, and she was so very tired. The gravel crunched under her tires as she turned down the path. The trees closed in around her, their branches forming a canopy that muffled the sound of the rain. Spanish moss hung like curtains from the older oaks, and she caught glimpses of something glowing softly through the mist ahead. When she emerged from the grove, Margaret gasped. Before her stretched a scene that seemed to belong to another time entirely. A large, rambling house that nestled in a natural depression between two gentle hills, its warm windows glowing like amber jewels in the twilight. The architecture was impossible to place, part Victorian cottage, part Mediterranean villa with wide verandas and climbing vines that seemed to embrace the structure rather than overwhelm it. But it was the ocean that truly took her breath away. The house sat perhaps 50 yards from the water's edge, where waves rolled in with a hypnotic rhythm that was somehow both powerful and gentle. The storm that had been raging above seemed to have no power here. The rain fell as a soft mist, and the wind whispered rather than howled. Margaret parked her car in what appeared to be a small clearing designated for vehicles, though she saw no other cars. As she stepped out, the scent of lavender and salt air enveloped her, and she felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in months. The front door of the house opened before she could knock. A woman emerged, perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair braided loosely over one shoulder and eyes the color of sea glass. She wore a flowing dress in shades of blue and green that seemed to shift like water in the lamplight. "Welcome," the woman said, her voice carrying the same soothing quality as the waves. "I'm Elena. We've been expecting you." Margaret blinked. Confused. Expecting me? But I didn't make a reservation. I just saw the sign, and the sign appears only to those who need to find us, Elena explained gently. And you look like someone who could use a good night's rest. Come, let's get you settled. As they walked toward the house, Margaret noticed details that seemed to shift in the corner of her vision. Garden paths wound between beds of flowers that bloomed in colors she couldn't quite name. Fountains bubbled softly, their water catching the light from lanterns that hung from invisible sources. Everything seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if the very air was suffused with peace. "How long have you been here?" Margaret asked as they climbed the wide steps to the veranda. "Time works differently here," Elena replied with a smile. "Some say I've been here for decades. Others swear they remember me from their childhood, though they're now older than I appear to be. The truth is, I've been here as long as people have needed a place to rest." The interior of the house was even more enchanting than the exterior. The foyer opened into a large living room with a fireplace that crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with books. Comfortable chairs and sofas were arranged in intimate groupings, and Margaret could see other guests, a man reading by the fire, a woman curled up with a cup of tea, an elderly couple playing chess in the corner. All of them looked utterly at peace, as if they'd found exactly what they'd been looking for. "We have a room ready for you," Elena said, leading Margaret up a staircase that curved gracefully to the second floor. "The ocean view's sweet. I think you'll find it suits you perfectly." The room was indeed perfect. Large windows looked out over the water, where the waves continued their eternal dance. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its linens white as seafoam and soft as clouds. A writing desk sat by one window, and a comfortable reading chair was positioned to catch both the ocean view and the warmth from a small fireplace. "Dinner is served whenever you're ready," Elena said. "There's no schedule here, no rush. Rest is the only agenda." After Elena left, Margaret stood by the window, watching the waves. For the first time in months, she felt the knot of anxiety in her chest begin to unravel. She couldn't explain what this place was or how she'd found it, but she knew with certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. Margaret woke to the sound of waves and morning light filtering through sheer curtains. She couldn't remember the last time she'd slept so deeply without the usual parade of worries marching through her mind. The clock on the knitstand read 9:30, but she felt no urgency to rush. In fact, she couldn't remember what she might be rushing toward. She dressed slowly, choosing comfortable clothes from her small suitcase, and made her way downstairs. The house seemed to stretch and breathe around her, rooms appearing exactly where she needed them to be. She found herself in a sun-filled breakfast room where Elena was arranging fresh flowers in a vase. "Good morning," Elena said warmly. "How? Did you sleep?" "Like I haven't slept in years," Margaret admitted. "I feel different, lighter somehow," Elena smiled. "The ocean has that effect. Its rhythm helps reset our internal clocks, reminds us of the natural pace of life. Would you like some breakfast?" The meal appeared as if by magic, fresh fruit that tasted like sunshine, warm bread that seemed to have been baked moments before, and coffee that was perfectly rich and smooth. Margaret ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching through the window as other guests moved through the gardens or sat reading on the various terraces and balconies. "Who are they?" she asked, gesturing toward the other visitors. "People like you," Elena replied. "Souls who need rest, who've forgotten how to be still. A businessman who worked himself to exhaustion, a mother who gave everything to her family but forgot to save something for herself, a teacher who carried the weight of her students' struggles on her shoulders. They all found their way here when they needed it most." Margaret spent the morning exploring the grounds. The gardens seemed to go on forever, each path leading to new discoveries. She found a greenhouse filled with the most beautiful flowers she'd ever seen, their petals shimmering with an inner light. A meditation garden featured a small pond where koi fish swam in lazy circles, their movements as soothing as the water. Itself, most enchanting of all was the beach. The sand was soft and warm beneath her feet, and the waves rolled in with a hypnotic regularity that seemed to slow her heartbeat to match their rhythm. She found a piece of driftwood to sit on and simply watched the water, letting her mind empty of all the concerns that had been consuming her. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed fluid here. She became aware of someone approaching and turned to see a man about her age, with kind eyes and graying hair. He smiled as he settled onto the sand nearby. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, gesturing toward the ocean. "I've been coming here well, I'm not sure how long. Time seems different here." "I'm Margaret," she said, extending her hand. "David?" he replied, shaking it gently. "I was a lawyer before I came here. Worked 8-hour days, lived on coffee and stress. I think I forgot how to breathe properly. What brought you here?" David was quiet for a moment, watching the waves. "I collapsed in my office one day. Just stopped. My assistant found me sitting at my desk, staring at nothing. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The doctor said it was exhaustion, but it felt like something deeper. Like my soul had simply given up." Margaret nodded, recognizing the feeling. "I lost my job and my relationship in the same week. I kept driving, thinking I was heading somewhere new, but I was really just running away from everything." "The wonderful thing about this place," David said, "is that you don't have to run anymore or chase anything. You can just be." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself settling into the rhythm of the haven. She discovered a library where she could lose herself in books she always meant to read. She joined a gentle yoga class. On the beach, led by a woman whose movements flowed like water, she sat in comfortable silence with other guests, sharing meals and smiles without the need for constant conversation. That evening, she found herself in the garden as the sun set. Over the ocean, the sky exploded in colors that seemed more vivid than any sunset she'd ever witnessed. Deep purples and brilliant oranges that reflected off the water in rippling patterns. Elena appeared beside her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Chamomile and lavender," Elena said, offering Margaret a cup. "Good for peaceful sleep." "Elena," Margaret said, accepting the warm cup gratefully, "what is this place really? I mean, I know it's a haven, but there's something more, isn't there?" Elena smiled mysteriously. "What do you think it is?" Margaret considered the question. "Watching the last light fade from the sky, it feels like a place between worlds. Like it exists in the spaces between seconds and the pause between heartbeats. A place where time stops so we can catch up with ourselves." "That's as good an explanation as any," Elena said. "The coastal waters have always been powerful, you know? They're the boundary between the known and the unknown, the place where change happens. People have been coming to the shore to heal for thousands of years." "But this is different," Margaret insisted. "This place is magical." "Is it?" Elena asked gently. "Or is it simply what happens when we finally allow ourselves to rest? When we stop fighting the current and learn to float?" Margaret sipped her tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. Around them, the garden glowed softly in the evening light, and the sound of waves provided a constant soothing backdrop. She realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about tomorrow or yesterday. She was simply here in this moment, breathing and being. "How long can I stay?" she asked. "As long as you need," Elena replied. "Some guests stay for a night, others for weeks. One gentleman lived here for nearly a year before he felt ready to return to his life. There's no schedule here, no checkout time. The haven provides what each soul needs. As they sat in comfortable silence, Margaret felt something shift inside her. The tight knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for so long continued to loosen, unwinding like a rope that had been tied too tightly for too long. She was beginning to remember who she was beneath all the worry and stress, someone who enjoyed simple pleasures, who found beauty in quiet moments, who had dreams and hopes that existed beyond the immediate crises of daily life. Margaret's third day at the Haven began with a dream she couldn't quite remember, only that it had been filled with gentle colors and the sound of singing. She woke feeling refreshed in a way that went beyond simple rest, as if something deep inside her had been renewed during the night. She found herself drawn to the beach before breakfast, her feet finding the now familiar path through the gardens without conscious thought. The morning air was soft and mild, carrying the scent of salt and wild roses. The beach was empty except for the endless dance of waves, each one catching the early light and throwing it back in diamonds of spray. As she walked along the water's edge, Margaret noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the far end of the beach, where the sand met a cluster of smooth rocks, steam rose from what appeared to be a natural hot spring. The water was crystal clear, and the steam caught the morning light like visible sighs. Elena appeared beside her as if summoned by her curiosity. "The healing pools," she explained, "fed by underground springs that have been flowing for millennia. The water contains minerals that are good for both body and spirit." Margaret knelt by the edge of the largest pool, dipping her fingers into the warm water. It felt silky and alive, and she could have sworn she felt a gentle current that had nothing to do with the spring's flow. "May I?" she asked, and Elena nodded. With a smile, Margaret slipped off her shoes and rolled up her pants to wade into the shallow end of the pool. The water was the perfect temperature, warm enough to relax her muscles, but not so hot as to overwhelm. As she settled onto a natural stone seat within the pool, she felt the tension she'd been carrying in her shoulders begin to melt away. "The water remembers," Elena said softly, settling onto a rock beside the pool. "It carries the peace of everyone who has found healing here. Each person who enters adds their own healing to the water, creating a cycle of renewal." Margaret closed her eyes and let herself sink deeper into the warm embrace of the spring. She could feel the water working on more than just her physical body. It seemed to be washing away layers of accumulated stress and worry, revealing something bright and vital underneath. "I keep thinking I should be planning my next move," she said, opening her eyes to look at Elena. "Looking for a new job, finding a new place to live. But every time I try to focus on those things, they seem less important somehow. What feels important now?" Elena asked. Margaret considered the question, watching the steam rise from the water around her. This moment, the feeling of being supported by something larger than myself. The knowledge that I'm exactly where I need to be, even if I don't know what comes next. "That's wisdom," Elena said. "Most people spend their lives running towards something or away from something else. They never learn to inhabit the present moment fully." As Margaret soaked in the healing waters, she became aware of other guests joining her. David appeared, looking more relaxed than she'd seen him before. A woman named Sarah, a teacher who'd been here for several weeks, slipped into the pool with a sigh of contentment. An elderly man named Frank, who'd been a carpenter before retirement, settled onto a bench nearby to soak his feet. They didn't speak much, but their presence was companionable. Margaret found herself thinking about the different paths that had led each of them here, the various forms of exhaustion and overwhelm that had brought them to the point where they needed this kind of radical rest. "I used to think taking care of myself was selfish," Sarah said eventually, her voice soft in the morning air. "I gave everything to my students, my family, my community. I thought that was what being a good person meant. What changed your mind?" Margaret asked. Sarah smiled sadly. "I had a breakdown in front of my 5th grade class, started crying and couldn't stop. The children were so worried about me, and I realized I'd been modeling self-destruction for them. How could I teach them to value themselves if I couldn't value myself?" Frank nodded thoughtfully. "I worked with my hands my whole life, built things that would last. But I never built any rest into my life. Kept going until my body forced me to stop. The culture tells us that productivity is the only measure of worth," David added. "But what if being is just as valuable as doing? What if rest is not the absence of productivity, but a different kind of productivity altogether?" Margaret let these words sink in as she continued to soak in the healing waters. She thought about all the times she'd felt guilty for taking breaks, for not being constantly busy and achieving. The idea that rest itself could be valuable not just as a means to become more productive later, but as an end in itself felt revolutionary. As the morning progressed, she found herself sharing stories with her fellow guests. She told them about the pressure she'd felt to constantly climb the corporate ladder, about the relationships she'd neglected in pursuit of success, about the way she'd lost touch with the simple pleasures that had once brought her joy. "I used to paint," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Watercolors mostly. I'd sit at my easel by the window and lose myself for hours. But somewhere along the way I convinced myself it was a waste of time." "What would you paint now?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked around at the magical landscape surrounding them, the steam rising from the pools, the morning light dancing on the water, the gardens stretching back toward the house with their impossible flowers and winding paths. "All of this," she said without hesitation. "The way the light changes the color of the water every moment. The way the steam moves like visible prayers. The peace on everyone's faces." "Then paint it," Elena said simply. "There's an art studio in the house. It has everything you need." After her long soak in the healing pools, Margaret felt different, lighter, more flexible in both body and mind. She made her way to the studio Elena had mentioned, finding it tucked away on the 3rd floor with windows that looked out over both the ocean and the gardens. The space was filled with natural light and contained every art supply she could imagine. Watercolors, oils, pastels, canvases, and paper of every size and texture. She chose a set of watercolors and a piece of heavy paper, then settled at an easel position to catch the changing light. As she began to paint, Margaret felt a familiar joy bubbling up inside her, the pure pleasure of creation, of translating the beauty she saw into something tangible. Her brush moved across the paper with a confidence she hadn't felt in years, mixing colors that seemed to glow with their own inner light. She painted the pools first, trying to capture the way the steam rose and dissipated, the way the water held and reflected the sky. Then she added the figures of her fellow guests, not as portraits but as expressions of peace and contentment. The painting seemed to paint itself, her hand moving with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than technique. Hours passed without her noticing. The light changed and she changed the painting to match, adding layers of color and meaning. When she finally stepped back, she was amazed at what she created. The painting seemed to pulse with life, capturing not just the visual beauty of the scene, but the feeling of being there, of being held by something larger and more loving than she'd ever imagined. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly from behind. Margaret turned, not startled by the interruption, but grateful for the company. "I'd forgotten how good it feels to create something. To be in that flow state where time disappears and you're just present. That's what the Haven is about," Elena said. "Remembering who you are when you're not trying to be someone else. Rediscovering the things that bring you joy. Not because they're useful or productive, but because they're part of your essence." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself in the garden again, but this time with the sketchbook Elena had given her. She drew the flowers, the fountains, the way the light filtered through the leaves. Each sketch was a meditation, a way of being present with the beauty around her. She realized that somewhere during her stay, she had stopped thinking about the Haven as a temporary escape. It had become a place of transformation where she was remembering not just how to rest, but how to live. The anxiety that had driven her here was still present, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it had become information, a signal, that she needed to make different choices, to prioritize her well-being alongside her ambitions. As evening approached, Margaret found herself back at the healing pools, now cooler and more mysterious in the fading light. She slipped into the water once more, feeling the day's discoveries settle into her bones. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new layers of healing. But for now, she was content to float in the warm embrace of the water, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, feeling more like herself than she had in years. The rhythm of the waves continued their eternal song, and Margaret let herself be carried by their music into a state of perfect peace. She was beginning to understand that the Haven wasn't just a place to recover from exhaustion. It was a place to remember what it meant to be fully alive. Margaret woke in the deep of night, not from anxiety or worry as she had so often before, but from a gentle pull towards something she couldn't name. The room was bathed in soft moonlight, and through her window she could see the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon, its surface shimmering like scattered diamonds. She slipped from her bed and padded barefoot to the window, drawn by a sound she couldn't quite identify. It was musical, like wind chimes mixed with distant laughter, and it seemed to be coming from the gardens below. Without fully understanding why, she wrapped herself in the soft robe that hung beside her bed and made her way quietly downstairs. The house was peaceful in the darkness, but not empty. She sensed the presence of other guests, all sleeping deeply, their dreams adding to the tranquil atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the Haven. The front door opened silently at her touch, and she stepped out onto the veranda. The night air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the ever-present salt of the sea. The gardens were transformed in the moonlight, taking on an ethereal quality that made them seem like something from a fairy tale. Paths glowed with a gentle luminescence, and the flowers seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Margaret followed the sound deeper into the gardens, her bare feet finding the smooth stones of the pathway without difficulty. The musical sound grew clearer as she walked, resolving into something that was definitely singing multiple voices, harmonizing in a language she didn't recognize but somehow understood. She emerged into a circular clearing she hadn't discovered before, where a group of guests sat in a loose circle around a small fire. The flames danced without crackling, producing no smoke, but casting dancing shadows that seemed to tell stories of their own. Elena sat among them, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her voice blending with the others in a song that spoke of ancient peace and timeless comfort. Join us, Elena said softly, patting the ground beside her. Margaret settled onto the soft grass, feeling the warmth of the fire on her face and the cool earth beneath her. "What is this place?" she asked, though she kept her voice low, not wanting to disturb the magical atmosphere. "The night garden," Elena replied, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "It appears only when the moon is full and the veil between worlds grows thin. This is where we share the deeper stories, the ones that can only be told in darkness." Margaret looked around the circle and recognized several faces from her days at the Haven. Sarah the teacher sat across from her, looking younger. In the firelight, David was there too, his lawyer's tension completely gone. But there were others she hadn't seen before, an elderly woman with wise eyes, a young man with paint-stained fingers, a middle-aged woman whose presence radiated quiet strength. "Who are they?" Margaret whispered. "Guests who have been here longer," Elena said. "Or perhaps guests who were here long ago and return when the night garden calls to them. Time works differently here, remember?" The singing continued, and Margaret found herself joining in without conscious thought. The melody was simple but profound, and the words seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. As she sang, she felt connected not just to the other voices, but to something vast and eternal. The rhythm of the tides, the cycle of seasons, the heartbeat of the earth itself. Stories began to emerge from the circle, told in the flickering light of the magical fire. The elderly woman spoke of a life spent caring for others, of dreams deferred and passions set aside, and of finding them again in the quiet moments between. Responsibilities. The young man told of losing his way in the world, of addiction and despair, and of discovering that creation could be a form of prayer. When it was Margaret's turn, she found herself speaking truth she'd never voiced before. She talked about the little girl who used to paint pictures of impossible worlds, who believed in magic and wonder. She spoke of the years when that little girl had been buried under expectations and obligations, when creativity had been labeled as impractical and dreams as childish. "I thought I had to choose," she said, her voice carrying across the circle, "between being responsible and being creative, between taking care of practical matters and following my heart, but maybe that's a false choice. All choices are false when they force us to abandon parts of ourselves," Elena said gently. "The world tries to make us smaller, more manageable. But here in the night garden, we remember our wholeness." The fire seemed to respond to their words, its flames dancing higher and casting more light. Margaret could see faces in the flames, not frightening but comforting. Ancestors perhaps, or future selves, or simply the faces of all the people who had ever sat around fires and shared their stories. As the night wore on, the circle grew quieter. Some guests slipped away, returning to their rooms and their dreams. Others remained, content to sit in the peaceful silence and watch the fire slowly die down to glowing embers. Margaret found herself lying back on the soft grass, looking up at the stars through the canopy of leaves. "The stars are different here," she observed. "Are they?" Elena asked, settling beside her. "Or are you seeing them differently?" Margaret considered this as she watched the constellations wheel slowly overhead. The stars did seem brighter, more numerous, arranged in patterns that spoke of stories and dreams. But perhaps Elena was right. Perhaps it was her vision that had changed, not the stars themselves. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Margaret said eventually. "About leaving here and returning to the world. But I don't know how to take this feeling with me. The feeling of peace? The feeling of being enough," Margaret clarified. "Of belonging somewhere. of being connected to something larger than my own worries and ambitions. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could hear the ocean in the distance, its waves continuing their eternal conversation with the shore. The haven exists wherever you remember to look for it, Elena said finally. In the pause between breaths, in the moment when you choose kindness over efficiency, in the space between thoughts. It's not a place you visit, it's a way of being. You can carry with you. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, though she wasn't sad. The tears felt like a release, like rain after a long drought. I'm scared, she admitted. Scared that I'll go back to the world and forget all of this. Scared that I'll get caught up in the rush again and lose myself. Fear is natural, Elena said, her voice soft in the darkness. But remember, you found your way here once. You can find your way back whenever you need to. Margaret woke to the sound of gentle bells, their notes carrying across the water like a musical breeze. She felt different, not just rested, but somehow larger, as if the night in the garden had expanded her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The memory of the fire, the singing, the stories shared under the stars felt both vivid and dreamlike. She made her way to the window and saw other guests gathering on the beach below. Elena stood at the water's edge, her arms raised to greet the rising sun, her white dress flowing in the morning breeze. One by one, the guests joined her, forming a loose circle on the sand. Margaret dressed quickly and made her way to the beach, drawn by an impulse she didn't question. The sand was cool beneath her feet, and the morning air carried the promise of warmth to come. She took her place in the circle, feeling the presence of the others without needing to speak. Each morning, Elena said, her voice carrying easily across the water, we greet the day with gratitude. Not for what we hope to accomplish, but for the gift of being alive, of being aware, of being present to the beauty that surrounds us. She raised her hands again, and the group followed her lead. Margaret felt the sun on her face, the salt air in her lungs, the solid earth beneath her feet. For the first time in years, she felt truly awake, not just alert, but alive in every cell of her being. Today, Elena continued, we celebrate the balance between being and doing. We honor both the rest we found and the action that will flow from it. We acknowledge that we are not separate from the world, but part of its healing. The ritual was simple but profound. Each person shared something they were grateful for, not the grand gestures or major accomplishments, but the small moments of beauty and connection. David spoke of the way the morning light made the water look like liquid gold. Sarah shared her appreciation for the sound of laughter drifting from the children's playground in the nearby town. Frank mentioned the joy of watching his arthritis pain ease in the healing pools. When it was Margaret's turn, she found herself speaking without hesitation. I'm grateful for remembering who I am when I'm not trying to be someone else. For the space between thoughts where peace lives. For the color blue in all its variations, the sky, the water, the morning glory vines climbing the garden walls. After the morning ritual, Margaret found herself drawn to the art studio again. Her painting from the previous day sat on the easel, and she was surprised to see how it had changed overnight. The colors seemed deeper, more luminous, as if the paint had continued to work while she slept. She began a new piece, this one inspired by the night garden. She painted the circle of guests around the fire, their faces illuminated by the gentle flames. But as she worked, the painting began to include elements that hadn't been there in reality, or perhaps had been there but visible only to the heart. She saw threads of light connecting each person to the others, creating a web of connection that extended beyond the circle to include the trees, the stars, the ocean itself. "You're painting the truth," Elena said, appearing beside her, as she often did, as if summoned by Margaret's need for understanding. "What do you mean?" "The connections you're showing, they're always there. Most people just don't know how to see them. But in places like this, in moments of deep peace, the veils become thin and we remember that we're all part of the same story." Margaret stepped back from her painting, seeing it with new eyes. The web of light she painted wasn't just artistic license. It was a representation of something real, something she was only beginning to understand. "Elena," she said slowly, "I think I'm ready to hear the truth about this place." "About what?" "It really is." Elena smiled, her sea glass eyes twinkling with something that might have been mischief. "What do you think it is?" "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that it's a place where the impossible becomes possible. Where healing happens not through medicine or therapy, but through remembering something we've forgotten. Where time works differently because we're operating by different rules, the rules of the heart instead of the rules of the world. And does that frighten you?" Margaret considered the question, looking out the window at the gardens where other guests moved through their day at their own pace, following their own rhythms. "No," she said finally. "It gives me hope. If a place like this can exist, if transformation like this is possible, then maybe the world isn't as broken as it seems. Maybe healing is always available if we know how to look for it. The haven isn't separate from the world," Elena said gently. "It's a reminder of what the world could be if we all remembered how to rest, how to be present, how to treat each other with kindness and ourselves with compassion." That afternoon, Margaret found herself in the library, drawn to a section of books she hadn't noticed before. The volumes were old and beautiful, bound in leather and filled with stories of other heavens, other places where weary souls had found rest and renewal. She read about healing springs in ancient Greece, about monasteries that offered sanctuary to travelers, about indigenous communities that honored the sacred nature of rest and reflection. "These places have always existed," she murmured to herself. Understanding dawning. In every culture, in every time period, there have been spaces set aside for this kind of healing. She chose a book of poetry and settled into a comfortable chair by the window. The poem spoke of transformation, of the cycles of death and rebirth that governed all life, of the way endings could become beginnings if we had the courage to let go of what no longer served us. As she read, Margaret felt the final pieces of her old life falling away. The job that had consumed her, the relationship that had drained her, the constant anxiety about the future. All of it felt like clothes that no longer fit, circumstances she had outgrown during her time at the Haven. But rather than feeling lost or uncertain, she felt free. The space that had been occupied by worry and striving was now filled with possibility. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she would face it from a place of peace rather than panic, from a sense of connection rather than isolation. That evening, as the sun set over the ocean, another display of impossible beauty. Margaret sat in the garden with her sketchbook. But instead of drawing what she saw, she found herself writing, not a list of things to do or problems to solve, but a letter to herself. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "remember this feeling. Remember that you are enough exactly as you are. Remember that rest is not laziness but wisdom. Remember that creativity is not a luxury but a necessity. Remember that you are connected to something larger and more loving than you ever imagined possible. When you leave this place, carry the haven with you. Look for it in the pause between breaths, in the moment when you choose kindness over efficiency, in the space between thoughts. It's not a place you visit, it's a way of being you can carry with you. Trust the process. Trust the journey. Trust yourself. As she wrote, Margaret felt a sense of completion, as if she were sealing a covenant with herself. The woman who had arrived at the Haven days ago, anxious, exhausted, lost, was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. She'd been transformed not into someone else, but into a fuller version of herself. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Margaret wondered if tonight would bring another gathering in the night garden. But whether it did or not, she knew she would sleep peacefully, held by the rhythm of the waves and the knowledge that she had found her way home to herself. Margaret woke on what she somehow knew would be her last morning at the Haven, though no one had told her it was time to leave. The knowledge came from within, a gentle certainty that her time of deep rest was complete, and that she was ready to carry what she had learned back into the world. She dressed slowly, savoring each moment of the morning ritual that had become so precious to her. The view from her window, the soft textures of the clothes Elena had provided, the way the light fell across the wooden floor, all of it felt sacred, worthy of attention and gratitude. Downstairs, she found Elena in the kitchen, preparing what looked like a feast. The table was set with the good china, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and herbs from the garden. "A celebration breakfast," Elena explained, her smile warm and slightly mysterious. "We always celebrate new beginnings." New beginnings? Your departure, of course. Though really, it's not a departure at all. It's expansion. You're taking the Haven with you. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, though she wasn't sad. The tears felt like gratitude made liquid, like joy that was too big to contain. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, "for all of this, for helping me remember who I am." "You don't need to thank me," Elena replied, setting a plate of fresh fruit before her. "You did the work. You allowed yourself to rest, to heal, to remember. That takes courage." One by one, the other guests joined them for the celebration breakfast. David appeared, looking like a different man from the exhausted lawyer who had arrived weeks ago. His face was relaxed, his eyes bright with an inner peace that seemed unshakable. Sarah came next, her teacher's warmth now extending to herself, as well as others. Frank brought flowers from the garden, his weathered hands gentle as he arranged them in a vase. "You're all leaving too?" Margaret asked, surprised. "We're all ready," David said simply. "The Haven gives us what we need, and when we've received it fully, we naturally begin to look toward the next phase of our journey." "But I'll miss you," Margaret said, realizing how much these people had come to mean to her. "You'll carry us with you," Sarah said gently, "just as you'll carry this place. And perhaps our paths will cross again, in ways we can't imagine now." The breakfast was leisurely and full of laughter. They shared stories of what they planned to do when they returned to their regular lives. But the conversation was different from the usual anxiety-filled planning Margaret remembered from her old life. Instead of frantically trying to control the future, they spoke of possibilities, of being open to what might unfold. "I'm going to start a meditation group at my old school," Sarah said. "Help other teachers remember that they can't pour from an empty cup." "I'm opening a small practice," David added. "Just a few clients, focusing on people who need legal help, but also need someone to really listen to them. And I'm going to build a workshop in my backyard," Frank said with a grin. "Make beautiful things for the joy of it, not because I have to." When it was Margaret's turn, she found herself speaking with a confidence that surprised her. "I'm going to paint," she said, "and I'm going to teach others to paint. But not just technique. I want to help people discover the peace that comes from creating something beautiful." "That sounds perfect," Elena said, her eyes twinkling. "The world needs more beauty, more peace, more people who remember how to be present." After breakfast, Margaret packed her few belongings, though she noticed that the suitcase seemed to hold more than it had when she arrived. Elena had gifted her art supplies, books of poetry, and a small journal bound in sea green leather. "For your thoughts," Elena explained when Margaret protested the generosity. "And for sketching the beautiful moments you'll encounter." Margaret's last stop was the healing pools, where she found herself alone with the steaming water and the sound of the waves. She slipped into the warm embrace one final time, feeling the mineral-rich water work its magic on her body and spirit. As she soaked, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred during her stay. The anxious, exhausted woman who had arrived in the rain seemed like a distant memory, though she was still part of Margaret's story. The difference was that now she was the author of that story, not its victim. She thought about the letters she had written to herself, the promises she had made to remember the Haven's lessons. The most important lesson, she realized, was that rest and healing were not luxuries but necessities, not selfish indulgences but acts of service to the world. When she finally emerged from the pools, Elena was waiting with a towel warmed by the sun. "Ready?" Elena asked. Margaret nodded, though she felt no urgency to leave. The Haven had taught her that readiness was different from rushing, that moving forward could be done with peace rather than panic. They walked together through the gardens one last time, and Margaret was amazed to see how much more she noticed now than she had on her first day. The way the light played through the leaves, the intricate patterns of the flower petals, the gentle sounds of water and wind and birdsong, all of it was part of a symphony she had learned to hear. Her car was waiting where she had left it, but it too seemed different somehow. The metal gleamed in the morning sun, and the interior smelled of ocean air and possibilities. "The road will appear as you need it," Elena said as Margaret settled behind the wheel. "Trust the journey." Margaret started the engine, surprised to find that she felt no anxiety about leaving. The Haven had become part of her, a place she could visit whenever she needed to remember her true nature. As she drove away, she looked back once to see Elena standing in the doorway, her hand raised in blessing. The house seemed to shimmer in the morning light, and Margaret wondered if it would be there if she tried to return immediately, or if it would fade like a dream until she needed it again. The drive back to the world felt different from any journey Margaret had ever taken. Instead of the usual anxiety about traffic or time, she found herself noticing the beauty of the landscape, the way the morning light transformed ordinary scenes into something magical. When she encountered a traffic jam, she simply turned off the engine and used the time to sketch the mountains in the distance. When she needed to stop for gas, she chatted with the attendant about the weather and found herself genuinely interested in his stories about his grandchildren. The world itself seemed changed, or perhaps it was her perception that had shifted. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more musical, and the faces of strangers more worthy of attention and kindness. She realized that the Haven hadn't removed her from the world, but had prepared her to engage with it more fully. Her first stop was the small apartment she had rented before her crisis, a temporary place she'd never bothered to make into a home. As she unlocked the door, she felt a moment of sadness for the woman who had lived here before, rushing out each morning, returning each evening drained and disconnected, treating this space as merely a place to collapse between obligations. But the sadness was gentle, not harsh. She felt compassion for her former self, understanding now that she had been doing the best she could with the tools she had at the time. Margaret spent the afternoon transforming the apartment with small changes that reflected her new understanding of what mattered. She cleared away the stacks of work papers and replaced them with fresh flowers. She moved her easel to the window where it could catch the afternoon light. She arranged her books of poetry where she could see them easily, reminders of the beauty that existed in words as well as images. That evening she called her sister, whom she hadn't spoken to in months. "Margaret," her sister exclaimed, "I've been so worried about you. Are you okay? Did you find a new job?" "I'm more than okay," Margaret said, surprised by the truth of the statement. "I'm actually better than I've been in years. And yes, I have found work, but not the kind you might expect." She told her sister about her plans to teach art and painting, about the studio space she had seen advertised near the harbor, about the vision she had for helping others discover their own creativity. "But is that sustainable?" her sister asked, her voice filled with familiar worry. "I mean, financially?" Margaret smiled, remembering her own obsession with security and predictability. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I've learned that there are different kinds of security. The kind that comes from knowing who you are and trusting yourself to handle whatever comes, that's worth more than any job title or salary." Over the following weeks, Margaret began to build her new life, but she built it differently than she had constructed her old one. Instead of forcing and pushing, she allowed things to unfold naturally. She visited the studio space and found herself in conversation with the landlord, an elderly man who had been a painter himself. When she mentioned her vision for teaching, his eyes lit up. "I've been looking for someone to breathe life back into this space," he said. "Why don't you try it for a few months? We can work out the details as we go." Margaret's first student was a surprise, David, her fellow guest from the Haven. He appeared at her door one evening, looking slightly embarrassed. "I know you're teaching art, not law," he said, "but I was wondering if you might help me remember how to play. I've been so focused on productivity for so long that I've forgotten how to do things just for joy." Margaret laughed, delighted by the request. "That's exactly what I'm teaching," she said. "Come in." They spent the evening painting together, not trying to create masterpieces, but simply enjoying the feel of brush on canvas, the way colors mixed and flowed, the meditative quality of focused attention. David left with paint on his shirt and a smile on his face, carrying a small canvas that depicted the ocean in shades of blue and peace. Word spread quietly through the community, and soon Margaret found herself with a steady stream of students. They came for different reasons. Some were stressed professionals seeking a creative outlet. Others were retirees looking for new adventures. And still others were people going through transitions who needed a gentle space to explore their feelings. But regardless of why they came, Margaret found that what she was really teaching was presence. How to be fully absorbed in the moment, how to trust the process of creation, how to find peace in the act of making something beautiful. Sarah visited one weekend, bringing stories of her meditation group and the changes she was seeing in her fellow teachers. Frank sent postcards from his travels, each one featuring a photograph of something beautiful he had noticed and wanted to share. "We're all connected," Margaret realized one evening as she stood in her studio, surrounded by the paintings her students had created. The Haven didn't just heal us individually, It sent us out into the world as agents of healing. Months passed, and Margaret settled into a rhythm that felt both productive and peaceful. Her morning ritual began with a few minutes of meditation, watching the sunrise from her apartment window and remembering the morning ceremonies on the beach at the Haven. She would then walk to her studio, greeting the shopkeepers and early commuters along the way, carrying with her the sense of connection and presence she had learned in that magical place. The studio became a haven in its own right. Margaret had decorated it with plants and comfortable seating areas, creating spaces where people could rest between painting sessions or simply sit and observe their own creative process. The walls were covered with her students' work, not the polished pieces they might display in their homes, but the experimental, playful, honest expressions of people learning to trust their own vision. One afternoon, as Margaret was preparing for an evening class, a young woman appeared at the door. She was perhaps 25, with tired eyes and the kind of tense posture that spoke of chronic stress. "I saw your sign," the woman said hesitantly, "about art classes. I'm not really artistic, but I was wondering, do you think painting could help with anxiety?" Margaret set down her brushes and really looked at the young woman, seeing in her the same exhaustion and disconnection she had once carried. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Jessica. I work in marketing downtown. 60-hour weeks, constant. Deadlines, no time for anything but work and sleep. I feel like I'm drowning." Margaret felt a familiar tug of recognition and purpose. "Jessica, I think you've come to exactly the right place. But first, let me ask you something. When was the last time you felt truly peaceful?" Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember," she whispered. "I don't think I've felt peace since I was a child." "Then let's start there," Margaret said. "Let's create some peace together." That evening's class was small, just Jessica, an elderly man named Walter who was recovering from surgery, and Maria, a busy mother of 3 who had been coming for several weeks. Margaret began, as she always did, with a few minutes of quiet breathing and intention setting. "Tonight, we're not painting pictures," she said. "We're painting feelings. Specifically, we're painting what peace looks like to each of us." She watched as Jessica's initial anxiety gave way to curiosity, then to absorption. The young woman's brush moved tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as she lost herself in the process. The painting that emerged was abstract but powerful, flowing blues and greens that seemed to move on the canvas, creating a sense of depth and tranquility. "I didn't know I could do this," Jessica said when the session ended, staring at her. "Painting with wonder." "You've always been able to do this," Margaret replied. "You just needed permission to try." Over the following weeks, Jessica became a regular student, and Margaret watched her transformation with the same sense of awe she had felt during her own healing at the Haven. The young woman's paintings grew bolder and more expressive, and her demeanor began to shift from tense and rushed to more relaxed and grounded. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jessica told Margaret one evening as they cleaned brushes together. "About permission to try. I realized I've been waiting for someone to give me permission to live differently, to make choices that prioritize my well-being over my productivity. And what have you decided?" "I'm giving myself permission," Jessica said with a smile. "I'm cutting back to 40 hours a week, and I'm using the extra time to paint and to be present with my life instead of rushing through it." Margaret felt a familiar warmth spread through her chest, the same feeling she had experienced in the healing pools at the Haven. She was witnessing the ripple effect of her own transformation, seeing how her healing was contributing to the healing of others. The studio became a gathering place for people seeking something different from the usual rush of modern life. Margaret began hosting mindful mornings, sessions that combined gentle movement, meditation, and creative expression. She started a monthly painting by moonlight event where people could come and create in the peaceful darkness, guided only by soft music and the gentle glow of candles. But perhaps most importantly, she began to notice how her students carried the peace they found in the studio out into their daily lives. Walter, the elderly man recovering from surgery, started a sketching group at his retirement community. Maria began incorporating creative time into her family's routine, setting up art stations where her children could express themselves freely while she worked on her own projects. "It's spreading," Margaret realized one evening as she stood in the studio, surrounded by the evidence of so many people's creative journeys. The Haven isn't just a place we visited. It's a way of being that we're sharing with the world. That night, Margaret found herself writing in the sea green journal Elena had given her, documenting not just her own continued growth, but the transformations she was witnessing in others. She wrote about Jessica's increasing confidence, about Walter's renewed sense of purpose, about Maria's growing ability to balance caring for others with caring for herself. As she wrote, Margaret felt the presence of the Haven as strongly as if she were still there. The sound of waves seemed to echo in the quiet studio, and she could almost smell the salt air and lavender that had been such a constant presence during her stay. "I understand now," she wrote. "The Haven isn't a place we go to escape the world. It's a place we go to remember how to engage with the world from a place of wholeness and peace. And every time we share that peace with another person, we're creating new havens, new spaces where healing can happen." She thought of Elena, wondering if the mysterious woman somehow knew about the work Margaret was doing, about the lives being touched by the lessons learned at the coastal sanctuary. Somehow she felt certain that Elena did know and that she was pleased. As Margaret closed the journal and prepared to leave the studio, she noticed something she had never seen before. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, was a small plant she didn't remember placing there. It was blooming with flowers that seemed to glow with their own inner light, the same impossible flowers she had seen in the gardens. At the Haven, she smiled, understanding the message. The Haven was always with her, always available, always ready to provide what was needed for healing and growth. And through her work, through the peace she shared with others, she was helping to plant seeds of that same magical healing throughout the world. Margaret turned off the lights and locked the studio door, but she carried the light with her as she walked home through the quiet streets. In her heart, she could hear the eternal song of the waves, reminding her that she was part of something vast and beautiful, something that connected all beings in a web of love and healing. The Haven lived on, not just in her memory, but in every moment of peace she helped create, in every person who learned to rest deeply and love themselves fully. And in that knowledge, Margaret found the deepest peace of all, the understanding that her healing was not just for herself, but for the world, and that every act of self-care was an act of service to the greater good. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Margaret could swear she heard the sound of waves outside her window, carrying her gently into dreams of endless possibility and boundless peace. The coastal haven had become part of her forever, and through her it would continue to touch the lives of countless others, creating ripples of healing that would spread far beyond anything she could imagine. In the quiet darkness of her bedroom, Margaret smiled, knowing that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. carrying the gift of the haven forward into a world that desperately needed its healing touch. And in that knowledge, she found the perfect rest that comes from living in alignment with one's deepest purpose and highest calling. The end.